So, I apologize that my glasses are currently reflecting the ring light. I tried a thing with new makeup that was sent to me from a very good friend of mine, Lee. It didn't really turn out the way I had hoped because I'm not a makeup artist. So anyway, I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all staying healthy and staying safe. And I know it says edible wild plants, but you can't eat that, honey. Hi. Go lay down, buddy. Good boy. Good boy doesn't mean come back. So I'm gonna plow through basically what I've been reading, what I finished reading, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about what I'm going to read. Keep in mind, my preferences are kind of flighty, so this is a general concept of the direction I want to go in as far as what I want to read, but I can't guarantee that that's what I'm going to be reading. I am, however, going to go over what I have been reading. I also have notes. So the first two books actually that I'm going to talk about are part of a series. It's what I talked about before, the Honey Badger series by Shelly Laurenston. So if y'all don't know the original story of the context behind why I picked up these books, you're gonna have to go to a previous video of mine, which is come organize my bookshelves with me. I mentioned it in that video. Don't tell anybody. I know if you guys have watched the video before and you want to tell people, don't tell people. Just shh. They're gonna have to check out the video if they want to see it. And yes, that's blackmail. I'm a Slytherin. What do you expect of me? So yeah, as far as these two books are concerned, they were very interesting, and by that I mean they were kind of typical of what I anticipated they would be. I went into these books with the front quote of the book in mind. When it comes to combining offbeat humor and mayhem, it's tough to beat Laurenston. That's RT Book Reviews who said that. Yeah, I kind of went into this thinking, okay, so it's gonna be humorous, there's gonna be kind of like a parody aspect to it, so I knew better than to take it too seriously. I know it seems like there's a lot of footnotes and stickies in here. I have a lot to say about these books. I'm just gonna summarize what these sticky notes are. There was really great characterization. Every character was an individual and they were very well rounded. It was a very character-driven plot, I guess you could say. I would say that, but there wasn't really any plot. There was no lore behind the shifters. From what I understand, these books are an offshoot of another series that Laurenston wrote, which is called the Pride series. So I'm thinking that I may have to dive into that series as well, just to understand a bit more of what's going on in this world, which isn't too bad. I wouldn't complain about that, apart from the fact that it doesn't really justify there not being any plot in these books. There are certain plot points in this that kind of come full circle throughout the series, which is also very cool. I can appreciate that, but there were also really useless scenes. Some of them were just there to validate how tough and strong and independent the female characters were. It felt less genuine. It just felt more like a plug. That wasn't really my jam. It just seemed like it was fluffing out the edges of the book and padding it with extra pages. So the premise of this series, from what I understand, is it revolves around three sisters, Max, Charlie, and Stevie. Basically, they have this deadbeat of a father named Freddie. They're constantly paying for Freddie's mistakes. He's always putting them into situations. He's always robbing their own family or getting them into crazy shit. Think of Shameless, but with shifters. There's also, I find, and this is probably a result of this being a spin-off of the Pride series, there are a lot of characters to keep track of. Like Laurenston was intending for this to be like, oh, I know that character, now we know how they're doing right now. But I never read the Pride series, so I don't know any of these characters or their significance. And I'm horrible enough with names in real life, so me having to follow, what was it? I tallied it at one point, and I think it was 20 or 30 names that were just thrown into this one book that I couldn't keep track of. I started just skimming over the newbies, and they never really served the plot in any way, so I wasn't really sure as to their significance apart from them just being shout outs. As a writer myself, I wouldn't really include any characters from other series that I was writing unless they were pertinent to the storyline and unless they served a genuine purpose. Otherwise, it just feels like fan service at that point, and I don't know. Fan service is nice, but if it's not pertinent to the plot, you don't need it. I think I rated them something like a 3 or 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. It's like I said before, the characters were very genuine, they were very believable, and there were a lot of times where it was just really funny. They were really fun, and they were very light and goofy, and I didn't really go in expecting to take them seriously, so if you're cool with very entertaining characters but no real plot, then this would be very enjoyable for you. One book that has quickly become one of my all-time favorite books, apart from like Harry Potter and the Fever series by Karen Marie Moning, is The Library of the Unwritten by A.J. Hackwith. I love this book. I love this book so much. I could not stop gushing about this book and recommending it to pretty much everybody I knew. I was not expecting it to be as fantastic as it was. So first of all, the story is incredibly compelling, especially as an aspiring author and writer such as myself and an avid reader. So it basically talks about this woman, Claire, who is the librarian in the Unwritten Wing in Hell. The Unwritten Wing is where unfinished manuscripts go, but sometimes they garner an energy where these books, they have to tell their stories. They escape somehow. They manifest as characters. It's basically the librarian's job to keep them contained. This series has a very steampunk / dystopian kind of feel to it. It's Warehouse 13, but in hell. And I love Warehouse 13. So it's very character driven. The plot is concise and easy to digest. It's got fantastic language. So basically, this book starts out each chapter with an excerpt from the journal of one of the librarians, the previous librarians or the current librarians of the Unwritten Wing in Hell. So because of that, I'm gonna read you the very first excerpt, and then I'm gonna read you the first paragraph, and you can tell me if you're not sold on this book, because I was the second I read it. Stories want to change, and it is a librarian's job to preserve them. That's the natural order of things. The Unwritten Wing of the library, for all its infinite magic and mystery, is in some ways a futile project. No story, written or unwritten, is static. Left abandoned too long and given the right stimulation, a book goes wrong in the head. It is a story's natural ambition to wake up and start telling itself to the world. This, of course, is a buggered pain in the ass. Librarian Fleur Michel, 1782 CE, Unwritten Wing, Librarian's Log Entry, Personal Ephemera, and Erotica. So this is the first paragraph. Books ran when they grew restless, when they grew unruly, or when they grew real. Regardless of the reason, when books ran, it was a librarian's duty to catch them. This book is fantastic! There's a lot more to the story than just one book manifesting and Claire having to go catch them. And the characters themselves are so endearing. Even the characters on the opposite ends of the spectrum, the antagonists, like Ramiel, Claire is flanked by 2 companions in travel. One of them is Leto, who is a very charming kind of newbie demon. And then you have one of the muses, who is named Brevity, who is one of her like right-hand girls, basically. All the exposition in this book had a purpose. And it wasn't just fly away. You had to grab onto it and you had to pay attention to it. My personal bias for this, for liking this book so much, is that it revolved around the importance of stories and how precious they were to the world and how the unfinished ones would always crave being told, so much so that they would tell themselves if they had the opportunity. Yeah, okay, it was a little bit too much exposition in some parts, but it wasn't overwhelming to the point where I was jarred out of the tale. I can't recommend this book enough. I think it was fantastic. It's one of my all-time favorite books ever, which I never thought would happen. I'm so picky about the books I read. Next up, This book, I was kind of doing a collaboration with the girl with all the zombies on Instagram and also Undead A to Z, her YouTube channel. I'm not going to say anything about this book other than the fact that I read it and I hated it, because there's a whole ass rant review coming for this book. I'm going to be reviewing the book, Zed is going to be reviewing the film, and yes, it's Warm Bodies, the twilight of the zombie genre. Oh god. I cannot say enough about this book other than I hated it. I hated it. I hated it. I don't know if you can see all my complaints embedded within the pages, but they are there, and I will be talking about them. I will say here that I first went into this book thinking that it was a parody, and then I researched an interview with the author and realized that it wasn't, and that he intended for this book to be very serious, which made it 10 times worse. I'm not going to say much about this book other than the fact that I read it and I hated it, because there is a full video that is going to be dedicated to this body of work, this warm body of work. Moving on, next up we have probably one of the first romance novels, apart from the Fever series, that I ever like got emotional over. A Heart of Blood and Ashes by Milla, Vane. Like, I'm just gonna dive right into it. The characters in this book were so intricate. The drama between the main couple that manifested was incredibly believable, and it was rife with tension. So much tension that I felt it swelling up in my gut every time they had an altercation. All to the point where I wanted to cry with them. I found myself aching when problems arose between the characters. I was so emotionally invested in their relationship. Like, I love twisted characters. I love redemption arcs. I love morally ambiguous characters. The more morally ambiguous they are, the more I love them. There's a reason I love Draco Malfoy, and it is because he is morally ambiguous, and I love him for it. I feel like it makes him incredibly realistic. I feel like morally gray characters in general are very realistic to me, because nobody on this planet is entirely good or entirely bad. And each person learns new lessons and grows and goes through their developments in different ways. And this book paid such close attention to redemption arcs and characters growing and learning about each other and the intricacies of a relationship and how it can be so easily broken but also mended when they both realize what they're doing to each other. The character development was just on fucking point. It was continuous throughout the story. The characters were constantly learning about each other and improving themselves and learning from their mistakes. And it was so believable. It was fantastic. Each one of them got kicked down in some way, and they found a way to scrape themselves back onto their feet again. And also the world building. This is actually a fantasy romance, and it was so well done. The world building was fantastic because it was done in a way that was still showing and not telling. Granted, there were times where it told a little bit too much and you kind of had to skim through and go, okay. But to be fair, it was the first book. It was the introduction to this world. And so it was still believable. It was just kind of info dumpy in some places, but it was acceptable. It also didn't jar me out of the storyline at all. That being said, I will issue a warning. This book is NC-17. We're talking blood, guts, gore, abuse, manipulation, the R word. So if you're kind of squeamish when it comes to any of those factors that I just mentioned, wouldn't recommend picking up this book. But for those of you who love twisted shit like me, then yeah, fucking pick up this book. We're gonna go to the fun part, which is my strips. I don't know if y'all remember me mentioning my strips before, but my strips are basically these lovely books that have the covers stripped off of them, which I got from work. Basically, we can't sell them. We issue them out of the system, and so if we want the books, then they strip the covers off so that we can't resell them. The first book that I wanted to talk about was My Darling Duke, which is that's going to come later. The first book I'm going to be talking about as far as my strips go is The Sum of All Kisses by Julia Quinn. This book was okay. It was kind of typical of what you would think a stock romance book is. It follows Hugh Prentice, who was injured in a duel a few years back, and he can't, like, his left leg, I believe, is a little bit unreliable now. He's kind of disabled at this point. It follows Sarah, who is the love interest, and basically Hugh entered this duel and ruined Sarah's cousin's life. It basically, her cousin was forced into exile by Hugh's father, and it nearly destroyed their family. So there's kind of a love-to-hate thing going on between the two of them. The disability aspect was portrayed fairly well. It was believable. It was brought up frequently because Hugh also suffers from a chronic pain in his left leg because of the muscle tissue. It was kind of torn, whatever. There were a couple of cliche points, but I will say that it didn't jar me out of the story or anything like that. It wasn't unbelievable. What was unbelievable was the ending. It was wrapped up very, very loosely. The main antagonist didn't play all that big of a part. It was just, I love you. You're so cute. But apart from that, it was an easily digestible story. I think I rated it 2 or 3 stars out of 5, mainly because the plot was a little bit contrived, but the characters were still themselves and they still had genuine moments, so I could still follow it. It was a 50-50. I could do with it, I could do without it. Next up, we have My Darling Duke, which is another strip of mine. This story follows Catherine Danvers, who is a wallflower. Her family was on the brink of financial ruin. Basically, to save her family, Catherine announces that she's engaged to the reclusive and mysterious Duke of Thornton, Alexander Masters. She does this so that she can basically use his connections to get her sisters financially well-endowed husbands. The problem is that the Duke kind of catches her ruse and shows up, and it's kind of funny. It was an interesting, inciting incident, I would say. I thought it was kind of comical because the main character, Catherine, or Kitty as she's called in the book, is so confident in what she's doing, and then she gets caught and she's thoroughly embarrassed. I kind of experienced a lot of that secondhand embarrassment with her. Oddly enough, the Duke is also somewhat disabled. He is sort of bound in a wheelchair after a really bad accident with a fire breaking out in his house. He's got scars pretty much everywhere. It's very difficult for him to walk. They kind of play on that a little bit, but there are parts of the book where it feels like he's not suffering from this disability at all. It seems like he's perfectly fine, and they only really show the amount of pain he was in afterwards. At one point in the book, he offers to dance with Catherine, and they do, and it's very elegant and blah blah blah, but my problem was I couldn't believe it because he just didn't seem like he was physically equipped to do something like that. And they showed him in pain after the fact, so it was kind of believable, but at the same time I had trouble kind of keeping up with it. It kind of felt very jarring. I felt like it could have been portrayed better. The ending for this book was incredibly rushed and not at all satisfying, mainly because there was no real antagonist in this book. There was no real obstacle apart from the very poor decisions the characters were making. They were very, despite their originality, they were very plot-driven characters, which is kind of suspected in a book like this. I forgot to mention, this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So not only are we shown this, but we're also beaten over the head with it. I think I gave this book like I think again, it was a 2 or 3 out of 5 stars. It wasn't anything special, but I also didn't hate it. What do we have? Oh, this is the last one. Oh no. I'm trying very hard to calm myself because I get the feeling that this is going to turn into a very impromptu rant. The last book that I'm going to talk about is called Morrigan's Cross by Nora Roberts. This is the very first Nora Roberts book that I have read. And I am so very, very upset that I am trembling with rage as I hold this book. I need to provide a little bit of context before I go into this. And I will state here that I am a huge, huge, huge fan of Irish mythology, dating back to pre-Christian Irish mythology. I'm talking about pagan Irish mythology. And the Morrigan is my fucking girl. I have done a metric fuck ton of research on the Morrigan herself. I am a huge fan of the Morrigan, so naturally when I saw Morrigan's cross, I was so excited. And not just that, but in this book, Morrigan is going head to head with Lilith, mother of demons. All right, I'm gonna give some leeway here. I have absolutely no qualms with people taking creative liberties when it comes to lore and mythology, because I feel like there's a lot to work with. When it came to a lot of mythology, particularly in Celtic mythology, it was told orally, and therefore there's a lot of different versions of it. However, when you name drop, I anticipate that you are going to stay true to that character. When I've done as much research on the Morrigan as I have, which I understand that not everybody has, she's a very rare character. With the amount of research that I have done on her, I can tell you, Nora Roberts read the Wikipedia page of the Morrigan and then disregarded everything she read on the Wikipedia page of the Morrigan. Okay. So the Morrigan, I'm gonna give you guys some pointers on the Morrigan so you know exactly what I'm talking about. In the original lore, the Morrigan was known as the washer at the ford. It's basically the woman who would predict the deaths of soldiers on their way to battle. You would see her at the ford or like a small creek or river, and she would be washing your bloodied armor on the edge of the ford. And that would indicate that you were going to die on the battlefield. Not just that, but she is also the precursor to banshees, aka the spirits who scream, shriek, keen, or sob hysterically in order to forewarn that your death or the death of someone you hold very dear to you is going to come. The Morrigan took on many forms. One of the forms was Maka, who was basically the battle or the wrath part or aspect of the Morrigan. She has been associated with Bav, who was the washer at the ford, the old lady who would predict your death. And then there was Morrigan herself, who was very elusive and very mysterious. Some of the tales that revolve around the Morrigan, I'm not going to get into them now, but basically this woman's a badass. She's a battle goddess, and essentially in this book, the only thing Nora Roberts got right was the fact that Morrigan had a way of speaking to you in your dreams or coming to you in a very elusive manner. And that was it. There was no mention of the woman at the ford, no mention of the battle goddess, there was no mention of banshees, there was no mention of anything apart from the fact that she's elusive and she needs to put a band of 6 warriors together and they need to take down Lilith. Because apparently Morrigan, the goddess of battle, couldn't do it herself. Which is a laughable concept in and of itself. I am so infuriated. The Morrigan was a deciding factor in the fact that I hated this book, but it was not just the Morrigan. It was the fact that, and I have my notes here because I don't want to deviate too far from the structure of my rant. The plot was rushed. The character growth was rushed, the love interest was rushed, everything was very forced. The magic system had no structure, no rules. I was actually more interested in the pairing of side characters than I was in the main pairing. As in, that's how fucking irritating the main pairing was to me. Lilith, as an antagonist, only ever attacked when the plot required her to, and then she would sort of shrink back into the shadows. She would show up randomly and then attack and then be defeated and then disappear into the night, and that was it. Usually it wasn't even her, it was just her minions. I will give an example, and yes, I'm going to spoil this book for you. I'm gonna put a tag where the spoiler begins and where it ends so you can avoid that if you want. 3, 2, 1. When the 2 main characters, oh god, I forgot their names. How telling is that? I think their names are Glenna and Hoyt. When Glenna and Hoyt get married in the end, Lilith's entourage, basically a couple of her heathens, they show up, they attack the wedding, they're defeated, they shrink into the night, and then Hoyt and Glenna get married as if it was just nothing. And that's the end of the book. There also was not nearly enough exposition apart from Hoyt and Kian, who were brothers. They're essentially the precursors for this whole story taking place. And I was more interested in their brotherly bond than I was in Glenna and Hoyt's relationship, and that's like the main focus of the story. You could really tell who was meant to be a plot device. They were very, very plot-driven characters to the point where the book was incredibly predictable. I was so mad by the end of this book that I couldn't handle it. But you know what? I'm gonna end my rant here because I could keep going and I really don't want to. That is the ending of the books that I have read. And we are going to move on to the books that I plan on reading that I may or may not deviate from. So because I recently read a whole bunch of books just for pleasure's sake, I decided to counterbalance that with a couple of research books. The books that I'm going to be getting into as far as research goes is going to be Edible Wild Plants. This is by John Kallas, PhD. One of my book series revolves around a witch. She's very attuned to herbal magics and herbal remedies and stuff like that, so that's where this kind of comes into play. I don't know if these particular books come with bibliographies, but we're definitely going to check it out. You know how we do up in here. They have a little thing of references here, which is very interesting. Ooh, How to Stay Alive in the Woods. Cool! Okay, so they're like science journal articles and stuff like that. The next couple of books that I have here are basically what I mentioned in my Vikings research reviews. So these books are going to come up in my research reviews. So we have the Poetic Edda. I'm also going to read the Viking Spirit. Then I'm going to read the Penguin Historical Atlas of Vikings. And then I have one I'm super excited for, and that is the Big Book of Runes and Rune Magic. The next few books that I have for pleasure reading are going to be this one book called Loki Ascending by Asa Maria Bradley. This is about Scott Brisbane, who is a human. He's developed an inner warrior, a berserker that wants to claim Iria Vainio as his own. And Iria is an immortal Viking healer, but she hasn't used her true powers for centuries. The last time she did, someone she loved ended up dead. Oh, so Loki is gonna come into play here, which is very interesting. I feel like it goes with the Viking theme that I have going on. Next up, I have something to counteract that, which is going to be Firefly. I'm so excited for this book. I love Firefly so much. Big damn hero. I love Firefly. I'm very excited for this one, and I know that there's a second installment already out that I'm probably going to be picking up if this one is any good. There's supposed to be a routine job transporting 5 crates from the planet of Persephone to a waiting buyer, but the client is Badgered. The crates are apparently full of explosives, which might blow at the slightest moment. Mal disappears before takeoff, and I guess Zoe has to choose between rescuing her captain or saving her crew. So yeah, this is like high stakes, just like it used to be. Awesome. Next up, I have Gillian Flynn, which is Sharp Objects. This one is about Camille Preaker, who faces a troubling assignment. She must return to her tiny hometown to uncover the murders of 2 preteen girls. For years, Camille has hardly spoken a word to her neurotic, hypochondriac mother or to the half-sisters she barely knows. Dogged by her own demons, she must unravel the psychological puzzle of her own past if she wants to get to the story and survive this homecoming. I'm excited about that one. So that's all I've got. That's it. That's it. It's done. It's done. It's done, River. It's done. So that's the end of that. Very anticlimactic, I know. Alright, so that was that. You can check me out on my socials. Yeah, I'm gonna get to reading. I hope you guys stay safe. I hope you guys have a good one. Cheers.